From the Toronto Star, I'm Rudgy Mudler, and this matters. We were promised a hot vax summer. The Delta variant has other ideas. With rising case counts and other indicators, there is no doubt that the fourth wave of COVID-19 is here. Despite having one of the highest vaccination rates in the world, experts are saying that it is nowhere near enough to stop another round of infections that could potentially overwhelm our healthcare systems. This wave will be centered on the unvaccinated, and there are alarming signs regarding younger people and children in other jurisdictions. Ed Tubb is an assignment editor at the Star who's been focusing on COVID-19 data. He's been with us many times to take us through the numbers. We welcome him back to discuss the fourth wave and where it looks like it's going to take us. Ed, thanks so much for returning to the show.
Happy to be here again.
Okay, Ed, you are our COVID-19 data guy, basically serving as a second set of eyes on the numbers. Let's talk a little bit about your methodology.
Yeah, I've been following local data. So the province is putting out its own data, and we have 34 local health units, all the municipalities across the province. And I've been keeping a close eye on those as kind of a second set of eyes, like you say, on the provincial numbers. But right now, what we're seeing, it's a province-wide sort of development. So those local numbers, they're important. It's good to keep an eye on them. But what we're looking at is really quite a lot more obvious than that.
So what are the numbers telling us? We've been anticipating the fourth wave, but it's here, right?
The fourth wave of Ontario's pandemic is happening sooner and faster than I think anyone thought just a couple of weeks ago. We had been talking about thinking that the fourth wave was going to roll up into Ontario, kind of how it did last year, which was starting from a very low level in September and rising through September into, getting to pretty decent levels in October. And the idea was that our level of vaccination would make that fourth wave relatively manageable. What we're seeing instead this year is that the fourth wave has started from a higher level than last year. It started sooner than last year. And at least over the last week or so, it's progressing actually faster than last year. So in terms of exponential math, what we've seen over the last 7 days, the last week in Ontario, is faster than at any point in the pandemic since way back in April 2020, like the very start of the very first wave of the pandemic, which is alarming. Now, we're not back up to very, very high levels of infection yet, but the way exponential math works is that if this level of infection continues, we're going to get there pretty quickly. So right now, we're looking at a fourth wave that's already begun and is on a pretty bad pace. And there's all sorts of caveats around that, because what we have right now and what we didn't have last year is we have vaccination. And that really, really does matter. But it doesn't mean that wave 4 is not going to be important. And it doesn't mean that it's not going to be possibly quite harmful for a lot of people in the province. It may change how it matters to you or me.
Okay, let's get into specifics. Ontario broke 500 cases today, but let's look at the pattern over the last 10 days. How much have they climbed?
80%. So we count infection rate in Ontario based on a 7-day average of reported cases. And over the last 7 days, based on how I'm counting, that 7-day average has risen 80%. So from last Wednesday to this week's Wednesday, it went up 80%. If you sort of do the math of that, that works out to a pace that doubles about every 8 days. So a doubling pace of about every 8 or 10 days, maybe it slows a touch, maybe it's 10, 12. Either way, that level is very, 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 very fast. And it takes us right back up to something comparable to wave 2 or wave 3 quite quickly. We're talking about maybe like next month kind of thing.
Okay. Did I just hear the Chief Medical Officer of Health say that these current case numbers are reasons not to panic? And then also Peter Juni, in our story, who's the head of the Ontario Science Advisory Table, said that we could have 1,200 cases by the time school starts, which to me sounds very worrying. I mean, how freaked out should we be?
Well, I don't think we should be freaked out. And in a way, both of those things can be kind of true. Our Chief Medical Officer of Health made those statements not a couple of days ago, like a couple of days before that. And this has changed quite quickly. I'm not positive he would say the same thing if asked about it today. Regardless, the level of infection in the province is growing extremely quickly. It's doubling quite quickly. It's not yet to the level where we're going to see a large number of people be hospitalized or die from COVID. Like, it's still pretty low relative to the highest it's ever been, but it's growing quite quickly. So we're not quite to the level where panic is imminent. I don't think that we're to the level where it's as bad as it has been in the past. I mean, in the past, we were talking about this virus ripping through long-term care homes and all that kind of thing. And right now, the vaccine helps us in that front. That said, yeah, if you look at the pace we're on, the description Peter Juni makes about us having quite high levels of community spread in time for schools to open is correct. That's the pace we're on. And the challenge in Ontario right now is that although we are as vaccinated as almost any jurisdiction in the world, we're facing a variant of the virus, the Delta variant, that doesn't seem to care as much about that in terms of spread. It does care about that in terms of protection. So if you are vaccinated, you have good protection against getting seriously ill from the Delta variant. But it seems that the vaccine is slightly less effective at stopping you from spreading it to the next person and the next person. And that makes it harder to just put a lid on this. And heading into the fall, heading into schools opening, of course, the other thing is that so far young children aren't vaccinated. So the reason that someone like Peter Juni, the director of the Science Table, is pointing towards schools is because that is a planned opening for a large number of millions of Ontarians who are not yet vaccinated to gather together inside. And we would have reason to expect that that would make things accelerate in Ontario amongst kids. And that is something to be concerned about.
Oh, I'm very concerned about that. But I actually want to take a little side step here. We're going to get to schools because obviously they're, it's on the horizon and very concerning. But I did want to touch on a data thing this week. One of the new data things is that in certain jurisdictions like Toronto, they're now giving a breakdown of vaccine status of people getting sick, right? And so now what this is showing is that the vast majority of people getting sick are people who have chosen not to be vaccinated yet, right?
The one caveat there is the word chosen. There are still people for whom they say that the reason they haven't got vaccinated is an access issue. Maybe they're working every day of the week. Maybe they have 2 jobs. Maybe they don't get paid time off. That is still a reason why people don't get vaccinated, and we shouldn't ignore it. But apart from that caveat, yes, we are clearly seeing that if you are unvaccinated, you are much, much, much more likely to show up in hospital with a serious illness from this Delta variant. The data that we're now seeing now from the province and a few other jurisdictions is showing a very, very clear breakdown. It is that despite the fact that the unvaccinated population in Ontario is now just 30%, and many of those people are very young children, is not a large population, but it's making up the largest share of hospitalized patients in Ontario care. And that's despite the fact that most unvaccinated people are predominantly younger and less vulnerable to the virus. So all of these things would mean those people shouldn't go to hospital as often. But the fact that they are going to hospital more frequently tells you that, yeah, it's a risk. So you or I, if we're vaccinated, even if wave 4 happens and it becomes severe in Ontario and a lot of cases build, you or I should have good protection if we're vaccinated. We still have good protection against this Delta variant in terms of getting seriously ill and dying. It's very good protection. If you're older or immunocompromised, you might have a little bit more concerns. You can still get sick. Seniors, your grandma, if you have a serious immuno issue, you can get sick, you can end up in hospital, and bad things can happen, even if you are vaccinated. That's why we need to be very careful. But for you or I, we can expect that if we get COVID after being vaccinated and we're young and relatively healthy, that we should be better. We should be okay. And that's why we're not seeing a lot of people who are vaccinated show up in hospital right now. But you don't make your pandemic decisions based upon the people who are going to be mostly okay. You make it based upon the people who are at risk. And right now, those people are the unvaccinated people. And those people are predominantly people under 40. A lot of younger people aren't getting vaccinated. A lot of millennials and Gen Z aren't getting vaccinated. And they're also young children who aren't eligible. So when you're looking at that 30% of Ontarians over 12 who aren't vaccinated, most of those people are younger. And then the other large group is kids.
We'll be right back. All of the precautions we've taken, or many of them, have been to try to protect our healthcare system from being overwhelmed. Is that still a possibility? And I believe Mr. Juni said to take a look at sort of hospital case counts as an interesting indicator right now. Tell me a little bit about that. Is that a fear still?
It's still the main fear, I think. If you look at what the province is doing in terms of how they're interpreting what's happening in the pandemic, they've switched. It used to be that they put a lot of emphasis on cases, reported cases, and now they're sort of turning towards looking more at hospitalization numbers, serious illness, that kind of stuff. In one sense, it makes sense because the reason we do pandemic measures is to prevent our hospital system from getting overwhelmed, right? So the way to check that that's not happening is to look at the hospital numbers rather than the case numbers. The caveat there, like the caution there, is that there are absolutely enough people in Ontario who are not vaccinated that if we had a huge wave 4, those hospitals could get overwhelmed again. There's absolutely enough people. That could happen. And the caution is that hospitalizations and serious illness and death, they're not as tied to cases as they used to be, because vaccines mean that fewer people who get sick are going to get seriously ill, but they're still tied to cases. So if we have an exponential shape to our wave 4 and it keeps doubling and doubling and doubling and doubling, that math is brutal, because over time, it doesn't matter if fewer people per case are going to hospital. If you just keep doubling the number of cases, which we could keep doing, it will happen that hospitals will start to get under pressure. So there's plenty of people in the province who are unvaccinated for that to happen. And we need to be careful about that. Like we are seeing in other jurisdictions, the US right now is struggling with a huge wave of Delta cases in a lot of states throughout the US. And the caveat here is that the US is less vaccinated than we are. But, we should look at examples like what's happening in Mississippi, where hospitals are starting to come under huge strain. We should look at that and not think that it can't happen here. We are better prepared than a state like Mississippi because of our vaccination rates, which again are near the best in the world. But if infections get back to where they were in wave 4, we'll see a lot of people hospitalized, and we should be prepared for that.
Okay, we talked a little bit about kids before, and it is absolutely what I'm watching in those other jurisdictions in the U.S. There's been a real COVID surge in sort of kids and hospitalizations, and some states where school has already started. So, do we have data on kids now? Are we seeing these spikes with them? And then the other thing is September. Are we headed for another sort of school shutdown probably if this continues unabated?
It's still true that kids are going to be seeing serious illness less often than adults, especially older adults. So it's still true, even with the Delta variant, that young children are less likely to end up in hospital with serious illness. The problem is we don't really have a good handle on what COVID does in the long term to people. It's only been not even 2 years, right? And it's been much less than that with the Delta variant. So we know that if you have a large number of infected kids, some of them will get seriously ill. Some of them might even die. We're seeing that in the US, right? There's going to be a larger number than that who get ill and have lingering problems. We don't know how large that number is. So when we look at what's going to happen when schools reopen in Ontario, we need to be keeping all those things in mind. Yes, it's true that a lot of kids can get sick with COVID and not very many of them will show up in a hospital. That's true. So if there are large numbers of infections amongst kids after we open schools, and that's something that happens with the Delta wave, it may not be something that puts a huge amount of strain on hospitals, just because Delta typically doesn't cause serious illness in kids. But we don't know how many of those kids are going to get COVID and are going to have lingering long-term, long COVID kind of issues. And when you're talking about children, that stuff really does matter. It's a big unknown. So right now, that's something that I would be looking at. I would be looking at seeing if we can figure out any kind of research on the impact of COVID on kids and get a sense of, okay, well, what would be the cost of a wave 4 happening if it's predominantly happening in schools? And as for a shutdown, I don't know. Right now, we're looking at a pace of change in this wave 4 that is headed towards pretty tough numbers, but we're not there yet. Right now, we're not at those tough numbers yet. We're on pace. We're where we were back in about late September of last year, where we were seeing these tough numbers, but we weren't there yet. Hospitalizations weren't rising yet, deaths weren't rising yet, but we knew where we were going. And lo and behold, we went there. So for now, we don't know that we're going to get there, but that's where we're headed. And the way that you stop that is either by vaccinating the rest of the population really quickly, or imposing some sort of public health measures to prevent infection. And right now, we're not vaccinating at a super high pace. So that one seems kind of out the window, at least in the near term, which leaves imposing sort of social measures to prevent infection. And we'll see what that means if we get there and if our governments decide that that's how they want to proceed.
Okay, Ed, obviously, I think people are prepare for some rising case numbers and kids in schools when they open. I think that's a given. But compared to the last 3 waves, can you sum up what we think the 4th wave is going to look like?
It's going to be younger. The main thing that's going to happen mostly among people who are unvaccinated. The people who are vaccinated are going to have good protection against serious illness. The worst impact of any wave 4 in Ontario is going to be felt by unvaccinated people, probably mostly by unvaccinated people who are also older. Adults who are unvaccinated are going to see the worst impact of COVID-19. If you or anyone you know is over the age of 60 and unvaccinated, they really should get on that as soon as possible because they are already at high risk from COVID. And the fact that Delta spreads as quickly as it does makes them at even higher risk. If you are under 60 and unvaccinated, you should also get vaccinated, not just for yourself, but for the people around you. Because if you are unvaccinated and get this Delta virus, it is extremely contagious and you can spread it to the people around you quite easily. And you may not get seriously ill and die, but the people around you might. And then finally for kids too. If wave 4 hits close to the levels of wave 3, if this pace continues into the fall, you can expect that younger and unvaccinated people will probably have a worse time of it than ever. We've seen this through the course of the pandemic. In Ontario's pandemic, wave 1 and wave 2 were felt overwhelmingly by seniors. The deaths that we saw in Ontario were 20-1 seniors to non-seniors. And then after wave 2, we started vaccinating all our seniors in nursing homes and everywhere. And in wave 3, it wasn't 20-1 anymore. It was 5-1. It was still mostly seniors. But in wave 3, despite the fact that far fewer people died overall, wave 3, we saw that more young people, more people under about 40, more of those people died in wave 3 than ever. And if we continue through into a really high growth in wave 4, we can expect that to continue. It's going to be felt much more amongst young people, especially amongst unvaccinated people, and probably also amongst kids.
Well, Ed, this has been fantastic for us. Is there anything that I didn't ask that you think that our listeners should know?
No, but I mean, I can reiterate that vaccination works. Every data that we have shows that the way the vaccine was promised to you at the start of all of this, that it would stop you from getting COVID in the first place, that it would help you, it would significantly reduce your chance of getting COVID in the first place. That's true. That it would significantly reduce your chance of spreading COVID to someone else. That is also true. That it would stop you from getting seriously ill. It's going to do a really good job of stopping you from getting seriously ill. And it's also going to mean that you are extremely unlikely to die from COVID. All of those things are true. The vaccine does all of those things. So that is the number one thing that we can be doing to slow this wave of COVID and COVID for the rest of our lives with this disease, is to change it from being, about 70% of Ontarians over 12 getting the vaccine to high 90s. And if we can do that, that's how you stop COVID. Because right now, the level we're at, the last month is showing us that's not enough. So we need to get better than that. And the only way we get better than that is if people who are unvaccinated get vaccinated. Ed,
I want to thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Ed Tubb is an assignment editor at The Star who has been focusing on COVID-19 data. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm your host, Raju Mudler. Our This Matters team is Adrian Chung, Brian Bradley, JP Fozo, Matt Hearn, Morgan Bachneck, Saba Etizaz, and Sean Pattenden. Our music is by So-Called, Mike DeAngelis, and Sean Pattenden. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com/subscribingmatters. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.